Welcome back, everybody. We are now in theme 2 of the workshop. This theme is really around, uh, you know, um, uh, 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 thinking about market participants and how market disciplining can, in some sense, influence the behaviors of market participants, particularly through the channel of public disclosures. We have a staging presentation followed by a panel discussion with a stellar set of panelists. For the staging presentation, we will be presenting a report, just at least key findings from the report within a 20-minute period of time. Although I certainly urge all of you to take a look at the full report itself. There's a lot of in-depth analysis that's available there, and then we'll go to the panel, which will be moderated by Anant Narayan. So for the staging presentation, I'm inviting Madhu Srinivas, who will talk about this. The topic is an assessment of banks and NBFCs public disclosures requirement against the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision transparency framework that they laid out a couple of years back. Over to you, Madhu.
Thank you, Deepthi. Can you please share the slides, Ranjita? Thank you. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Good morning, Professor Chipalkatti. I'm Madhu Srinivas, working as a senior research associate at Dvara Research. As Deepthi mentioned, in this presentation, I'll be setting the context for the succeeding panel discussion on transparency and market discipline. I'll be taking you through an abridged version of a research paper we had published earlier this year. In the paper, we assess the public disclosure requirements of scheduled commercial banks, urban cooperative banks, regional rural banks, and NBFCs against the transparency framework of BCBS. However, in my presentation today, I'll be restricting my focus to only SCBs and NBFCs, and will try to highlight the main themes and issues that emerge from our analysis. This will form the prelude for the insightful and engaging panel discussions that will follow. Next slide. So in our agenda for the presentation today, first, I'll be giving you background by elaborating on the market discipline, the link between transparency and market discipline, and a brief literature survey on the topic. Next, I'll be briefly explaining our analytical methodology and the scope of a study. And finally, I'll move on to discussing our major findings in some detail. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So, what is market disciplining now? Market disciplining in the context of credit institutions can be described as the mechanism by which market participants identify, monitor, and, where required, discipline the risk-taking activities of these institutions. In fact, the Basel III framework for banking regulation recognizes market discipline as one of the 3 pillars that help in regulating banks and maintaining systemic stability. In the framework, the pillar of market discipline is complemented by capital regulation and regulatory supervision. With regard to banks and NBFCs, there are 3 broad, non-mutually exclusive channels through which market disciplining works: the private investor channel, the public investor channel, and finally, the depositor channel. Integral to the effective functioning of the depositor and the public investor channels is the availability of transparent public disclosures, which should be the focus of our presentation today. Next slide. So before we look at transparency and financial stability, it would be instructive to understand what we mean by transparency. Right? So BCBS gives a useful definition. It defines transparency as public disclosure of reliable and timely information that enables the users of that information to make an accurate assessment of the bank's financial condition and performance, business activities, and so on. The main takeaway here is that transparency is not merely the disclosure of information, but disclosing information in a manner that aids accurate assessment of the financial health of the entity. Thus, transparency acquires certain dimensions like reliability, timeliness, comparability, and so on. And we will be elaborating on these dimensions later on in this presentation. Another important point that we have to note in understanding the link between transparency and market discipline is that transparent disclosures are necessary but not sufficient input in achieving market discipline. This is because market participants have cognitive and computational constraints in processing that information. Also, the decisions that they eventually take are also influenced by their own biases and other idiosyncratic forces. Having said that, transparent disclosures can still play an important role in aiding financial stability. In particular, the relationship between transparency and financial stability can be described in terms of two beneficial outcomes which can result from market disciplining. One, detection and prevention of problems from occurring by incentivizing banks to behave prudently and efficiently. Through transparent disclosures, market participants are better able to assess the risks facing banks and NBFCs and thus can ration their supply of funds in a manner that would induce these entities to behave prudently. Secondly, in times of stress or crisis, market participants who have transparent disclosures will be better able to distinguish between healthy banks from those that are vulnerable and thereby reduce contagion risk. Next slide. So now, when we look at the literature review on disclosures and economic outcomes, we find that in the financial space, we find that there is considerable evidence backed by theoretical arguments on the economic benefits of greater transparency of disclosures, both at an individual level and at a system level. The theoretical argument suggests that firms with higher levels of disclosures can get funds at lower cost as there is reduced information asymmetry. Also, investors would be better able to differentiate low-risk banks from high-risk ones and provide funds at the appropriate price. Empirical evidence from other jurisdictions support these arguments. In India, studies which evaluate transparency of disclosure standards are sparse and not comprehensive enough. There are empirical studies which analyze actual disclosures published by banks in their financial reports and compare them against the transparency index. Our research paper takes an ex-ante approach over here and assesses the quality of regulations that prescribe public disclosures. Next slide. So this brings us to our research objective. So the objective of our paper was to assess the public disclosure requirements applicable to India's banking system participants and comment on the level of transparency they enable. To be clear, the objective of the study was to look at the regulations themselves and assess their quality and not the actual disclosures made by the entity. Next slide. Next slide. So, to define the scope of our presentation today, so as mentioned earlier, this presentation will only focus on the regulations applicable to scheduled commercial banks and NBFCs. In particular, we only assess regulations on public disclosure of information on risk management strategies and practices, risk exposures, and financial position. And when we say regulations, we mean regulations by RBI, SEBI, and the ICAI accounting standards affecting the public disclosures by these entities. Next slide, please. So coming over to the framework that we actually use to assess the transparency. So to analyze the disclosures for their quality and consequently the level of transparency they enable, we used a transparency framework given by the Basel Committee publications in their report titled Enhancing Bank Transparency. So the framework outlines 5 broad dimensions that contribute to transparency. Briefly, they are: first is comprehensiveness. So in this dimension, it pertains to the level of aggregation and consolidation that the information represents, the disclosed information represents. Here, we assess if the information presented includes all entities and activities that it's supposed to present. Then we have relevance and timeliness. So in this dimension, the focus is on gauging whether the information being presented is relevant to the user and if that information is presented at the appropriate time intervals. I'll be elaborating on these sort of dimensions later on when we move on to the findings. On reliability, this dimension describes the faithfulness or otherwise of the information presented to the atomic activity it purports to represent. Coming to comparability, we realize that definitions and measurement concepts need to be comparable across peers and across time periods to differentiate between entities and also assess the growth of a given entity. So that's how you can make meaningful comparisons, right? So this dimension describes this level of such comparability. And finally, we come to materiality. So any public disclosure, the information being disclosed needs to represent material economic activity for the of the entity so that the user can make some meaningful and informed decisions of that entity. In outlining these dimensions, we recognize that there is a considerable level of subjectivity in interpreting these dimensions, and more so when evaluating these dimensions, evaluating these disclosures against them. It also needs to be noted here that these are not particularly mutually exclusive or watertight sort of dimensions, and there is considerable overlap between them. Next slide, please. So now I'll present some of the main findings of our assessment pertaining to scheduled commercial banks and NBFCs. Next slide, yeah. So coming to scheduled commercial banks. So overall, we find that the disclosure standards applicable to SCBs fare well on the dimensions of comprehensiveness, reliability, and comparability. On timeliness, our assessment evaluated whether the frequency of disclosure matched the minimum time it takes for risk to materialize. When we say risk, over here, risk can be thought of as any event causing a material change in the book of accounts. For instance, for credit risk, it is at least 90 days since scheduled commercial banks are following Indian GAAP, while market risk can manifest in a much shorter period. We find that RBI disclosures are mostly annual in nature. For instance, RBI disclosure on capital adequacy, which include information on the various components of capital, both Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital and risk-weighted assets, are required to be made only annually. However, the capital of a bank can get eroded if any of the business risks it takes materializes. For instance, credit risks that banks are exposed to could materialize over the period of a quarter. Now, Basel III disclosures mitigate this inadequacy by requiring banks to make disclosures on capital adequacy and credit risk at every quarter. However, looking further, we find that the disclosures were lacking on the dimensions of relevance and materiality. On relevance, let's take the second example on the slide. Okay. Any meaningful analysis of risk exposures of a bank would require information on the various components of risk, sources of risk exposure, and expected impact of such risk on the financial health of banks. The current disclosure requirements, however, do not give this complete picture. Here, risk metrics such as PV01, bar, duration that capture the sensitivity of investment portfolio of banks to various risks are not required to be disclosed. With regard to materiality, we find that there is no requirement to disclose the risk drivers that affect the balance sheet of banks. Now, given that stress tests are conducted on individual banks, disclosure of the stress test design and its results would give a much clearer view of the overall risk management ability of the banks. This is because the design of the stress test scenarios gives an insight into the management's view on the relevant risk drivers, while the results of the stress test themselves indicate the impact of the evolution of these risk drivers on the balance sheet of the bank. Next slide, please. Moving on to NBFCs. For NBFCs, we have restricted our analysis to only those which have permissions to raise liabilities from public investors and depositors. This includes all deposit-taking NBFCs and only listed non-deposit-taking systemically important NBFCs. So largely, we have two sets of disclosure standards under which these NBFCs would fall. In the first category, we have listed NBFCs and unlisted deposit-taking NBFCs for whom Ind AS is applicable. For listed NBFCs, SEBI disclosures also become applicable. In the second category, we have only unlisted deposit-taking NBFCs which have a net worth of less than 250 crores and hence only Indian GAAP is applicable. For all NBFCs covered under this study, the same set of RBI disclosures were applicable. Next slide, please. First, we'll take a look at the set of NBFCs for which Ind AS is applicable. From our analysis, we find that these NBFCs fare well on the dimensions of comprehensiveness, comparability, and materiality. However, on reliability, unlike scheduled commercial banks for which Indian GAAP is applicable, Ind AS requires NBFCs to disclose information that can help evaluate the nature and the extent of risks arising from financial instruments to which they are exposed to at the end of a reporting period. NBFCs are accordingly required to provide an overview, a qualitative discussion for each type of risk, be it credit risk, liquidity risk, or market risk, including methods which have been used to measure the risks and assumptions underlying the risk models. Such qualitative information can complement quantitative information on risk exposures, thus increasing the overall reliability of information provided. However, the disclosures are found wanting in the remaining dimension of transparency, that is on timeliness and relevance. On relevance, let's take the first example on the disclosures related to advances. One dimension that can reveal the riskiness of credit exposures is the economic sector in which they are originated. Currently, RBI disclosures do not have any requirement for these NBFCs to disclose such information. It is in fact available only for those advances which have already turned risky, that is, become non-performing assets. A clear definition of these economic sectors and mandating the disclosure of such granular information would be very useful and would enable comparison across comparison of risk profile across NBFCs. With regard to timeliness, almost all disclosures by NBFCs are made only on an annual basis. The annual periodicity of disclosures is too long a time to capture the materialization of any risk that the NBFC would be exposed to, especially credit risk. Next slide. With respect to unlisted deposit-taking NBFCs for which Indian GAAP is applicable, we found that the disclosures fared well only on the dimensions of comparability and were found to be inadequate on the rest of the dimensions. On materiality, for instance, while RBI's liquidity risk management framework requires NBFCs to design and conduct stress tests on regular basis for various short-term and protracted stress scenarios, there is no requirement for the NBFCs to make any of this information public. And this, as we had elaborated earlier, in the case of HCBs, is material information that can help the users of that information better understand the risk profile and the overall risk facing the NBFCs. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So before I conclude, I would like to provide an update on RBI's regulations on public disclosures. So post the publication of our assessment, RBI came out with a master direction on presentation and disclosure of financial statements. While it improves upon the existing disclosures in certain areas, it reduces information disclosure in certain other areas. To illustrate, the new disclosures on business segment reporting are less granular than what was required earlier. In contrast, the disclosure on investment portfolio now includes gross and net values of the AFS and HFT portfolios, whereas earlier only the HTM portfolios, information only HTM portfolios available. So with this, I'd like to end my presentation and hand over the proceedings to Deep. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madhu. I think the presentation has actually raised a lot of detailed commentary on what are public disclosures that are currently required and what are the implications of that for the kinds of information that's available publicly for people to judge financial institutions, particularly credit institutions, on the credit risk that is sitting on their books and the and so, I think one question that we have to always think in the back of our minds is, why is this important to financial inclusion? This has direct impacts on the abilities of, the entities who are actually serving low-income households, and to the extent that there are certain sort of behaviors as well as thresholds that get set in the market in terms of institutional behavior. That has implications for, elements such as ability to understand the risks that are sitting on balance sheets, ability to know incipient signals from the market in terms of are these portfolios going bad or not? Is the market pricing all of the information that is there available in the public domain? And if not, what else is being priced in? So I think within all of this, how do we think about financial institutions in India, particularly the smaller, lower rated entities vis-a-vis the larger, better rated entities? We've also had a set of crises in the past 5 to 6 years. All of this leading us to question what needs to be done here. Is there an angle here to be explored? So this particular presentation was an attempt at just unpacking some of the issues there. But I now invite Mr. Anant Narayan to actually lead this panel. We have so Anant Narayan is an advisor to the FSD initiative, and he's also associate professor at SPJ Institute for Management and Research. But we have as panelists, we have a stellar set of panelists here. We have Dr. Niranjan Chipalkatti, who is the Tenuous Professor of Accounting at Seattle University, and he is kindly obliged to participate, even if it's just terrible timing for him. It's really middle of the night. We have Nandini Vijay Raghavan, who is head of research at Korea Development Bank, and we have Dr. Harshvardhan, who is executive in residence at the Center for Financial Studies, and an adjunct faculty at the same place, which is SPJ Institute for Management and Research. And last but not the least, Sankaran Narayan, who is the Chief Investment Officer at ICICI Prudential AMC. Welcome all of you to this panel discussion. And over to you, Anand, to take this forward. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Deepti, and to the entire Dvara team. I hope I'm audible and visible. Apologies, I'm traveling, so I don't know how the quality of my connection and Wi-Fi is. In case I drop off, Deepti, I'm sorry to give you a mini heart attack, but you'll have to take over as being the anchor for this particular show. But thanks again, Madhu. Fantastic presentation, and to the entire Dvara team, very good paper put together, very thought-provoking, and nice segue into a discussion around supporting market participants and market disciplining via improving public disclosures. And as you mentioned, Deepti, we've got a stellar panel with us. I'm personally looking forward to learning a lot from each of these panelists. Now, the way we'll do this is, rather than ask questions right away, we'd love to hear the panelists give us their take on this particular topic. They have vast experience. We've got a good mix of academics, people who've seen the rest of the world, seen India, people who have actually practiced here and have been some of the market participants that this discussion hopes to kind of enrich. So rather than define to them what the perspective ought to be, we want to hear them and get their perspective on this particular topic. They will each speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, but there is no time limit. Please use your time in case you're making some points. Please go ahead. If it does go too long, I will jump in, but otherwise we look forward to some rich inputs. After each of the 4 panelists have had their say, then we'll have a Q&A, a discussion. That will be more in the form of open house. All of us can chip in and give in our points. The audience is also encouraged to come in with your questions and make this an interactive kind of a discussion. So I'm going to start with Professor Chipalkatti. I'm going to call him Niranjan. Niranjan, first of all, thank you so much for dialing in this unearthly hour. Really, really appreciate this on the behalf of Dvara and all of our participants here. The floor is yours, sir, and all over to you now.
Thank you so much, Anand. I do truly appreciate being invited to be a panelist by Dvara Research, and I thoroughly appreciated the presentation by Madhu and by Deepti about the scheduled commercial banks and the NBFCs in India and the disclosure requirements imposed on them. And it was informative, and I have talked to them before, and I'm looking forward actually to taking this forward in terms of more research. As I understand it, someone will be playing my PowerPoints, so I'm just waiting for that to happen. There we go. I'm ready for that. And good morning to everyone. Good evening to you. So I'm ready with this whole conversation. This is like literally 4:30 in the morning for me. So I'm going to have a really exciting day because I'm going to wake up tomorrow at an earlier time actually to go for a hike, which is 3 hours away from where I stay. So the topic today is market monitoring and market disciplining of credit institutions. So for me as a professor and a researcher, the very first question I ask is, what do we mean by market discipline? What do we mean by market monitoring? That's the context within which I would like to frame everything that goes on after this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Madhu actually did a wonderful job of defining market discipline, and I see it as right there from mere involvement. the ability of market participants to discipline banks for excessive risk-taking, which then raises the question, who do we mean by market participants? What do we mean? How is the disciplining mechanism? What do we mean by risks? What are the risks that we are talking about? I mean, those are questions worth considering. And typically, in its strong form of market discipline, we are thinking of ex-ante discipline. So we are not waiting till the event happens, sort of like the financial crisis, before the market disciplines everyone, or like what's happening right now with Evergrande in China. It's not supposed to be ex-post. It's in a strong form, and it's supposed to be ex-ante. We all know that it's part of the Basel standards, but essential to market discipline is the notion that market prices are efficient, that they impound information about risk, and they provide not noisy signals about risk to market participants. All I can say is right now, the research has shown that it's perhaps the weak form of market discipline that exists in most parts of the world. Next slide, please. Thank you. And why is it important? Because the sense is, especially in the weak form, that it supplements the collective wisdom of the market, will provide better governance, it will help the regulator. That is why it's one of the pillars of, according to the Basel standards. Okay, it's an important pillar. It enhances stability for the financial sector, reduces and thereby reduces friction to execute monetary policy. As Madhu referred to on his slide, is something that there's a lot of research on. It decreases the cost of funds due to reduced levels of information asymmetry. And that is important from the lens of India. If we are talking about privatizing public sector banks, one of the most important ingredients of that process would be ensuring that there's market discipline and reduced levels of information asymmetry. Otherwise, you will not be able to make the market for such banks. Next slide, please. So about risk, I mean, and this, the audience, I mean, everyone knows about this. We're talking about credit risk, we're talking about market risk related to investment portfolios, derivatives, something that Madhu referred to, had to do with more disclosures available for sale and trading securities, as opposed to just for HTM, held to maturity securities. Currency risk, operational risk, cybersecurity is a big issue nowadays, capital adequacy, whether the bank meets the requirements or not, leverage risk, liquidity risk, and excessive regulatory arbitrage. When you talk of the financial crisis, a lot of that happened because they were off-balance sheet special purpose vehicles that triggered off a lot of the crisis. And then you have contagion risk also. So there are a lot of risks that are part of banking in the banking sector, and especially the non-banking financial sector also. Next slide, please. Who are the market participants? Now, this is important because extant theory suggests that it's depositors, debt holders, especially subordinated debt holders. Increasingly, there's a sense that equity stockholders should be part of the market discipline process, and I would agree. Regulator, I put regulator there question mark because they seem market discipline complements regulatory action. It does not compete with the same. And I have included that because in its weak form, the regulator uses market signals to make policy decisions. Next slide, please. How does it work? So ex ante, as risk-taking increases for the bank, the sense is the market will discipline in the following fashion, that bank interest rates will increase for depositors. Deposit growth will decrease. Depositors will take their deposits and move to a better bank, quote unquote, better bank. Bank capital buffers will increase. Execution of strategies will be incorporated in the bank's policy to minimize or to reduce bank operational risk. Maybe regulatory or oversight action will be triggered by regulators. So there'll be stress tests, for example. And perhaps there'll be increased level of voluntary. And as we have seen now in the case of RBI's requirements for, in the case of India, mandated information disclosure. I use those separately because mandated disclosures make it a level playing field for everyone, but voluntary disclosures are often a way that a good bank, quote unquote, signals to the rest of the market, like in the market for lemon scenario, that they are better than the rest of the other banks. Next slide, please. So market discipline is predicated by three things, okay? That market participants have the ability to monitor the bank's financial conditions and interpret the information. So that is the aspect of transparency. It is actionable. You can understand what the bank is talking about, and it is communicated properly. That there is an ability to influence the bank manager's behavior through market mechanisms and contracting. Number two is important too. And finally, number three is that market participants are compensated for risk-taking, thereby providing an incentive to monitor. So if that compensation for risk-taking does not happen, there is no incentive for market participants to monitor. So all these three pieces have to be in place for us to have good market discipline, effective market discipline. We are primarily talking about item number one today when we talk about the ability of market participants to monitor banks' financial conditions and interpret the information disclosed, so market transparency. Next slide, please. Market transparency has an important role to play because it makes prices more informative. And of course, when I say this, I'm ignoring the whole literature in economics about irrational behavior and behavioral economics. We all assume that investors and participants will behave rationally when they see information. It reduces information asymmetries. So it signals and provides information to uninformed, unsophisticated investors. It can be achieved through relevant, reliable, timely risk disclosures, something that Madhu just talked about. Their working paper has an excellent table with the requirements for different banks in India. There's a role of accounting standards. And I say this, for example, right now, in the United States, we are starting to incorporate the expected credit loss standard, which is a new loan loss provisioning standard, as opposed to the previous standard where only after there's a clear signal that it is non-performing, you provide for the loan loss. So accounting standards play an important role in market transparency. Public information versus private information, in the sense that if they should not be private signals to private channels, and credit rating agencies sometimes get private information as opposed to publicly disclosed information. That can vitiate the market disciplining mechanism if there's private information flowing out from the bank. And it's not just about accounting information, it can be non-financial information, management forecasts, etc. Problems can happen if the information is not timely or not relevant, and that's a lot of that we have seen from Dvara's research. But mind you, that has to do with the quality of the regulation, not so much about the voluntary disclosure or disclosures being made by bank. It could just be too complex, the information, and sophisticated investors understand it. So we end up generating private information for sophisticated investors as opposed to public disclosure to everyone. Next slide, please. Can market discipline fail or weaken? I mean, there is a lot of us believe that in the financial crisis, market discipline did not work. It worked ex post. Everyone woke up one fine morning in September when Lehman Brothers had a problem. And depositors may have no incentive to monitor if there's deposit insurance, or there might be another reason why depositors may not react, because they are not risk sensitive and to market prices. Banks are too big to fail. So market participant says, who cares? Nothing's going to happen really. Banks may be over-regulated and market participants have no incentive to monitor. The regulator misinterprets signals, and there's a lack of political will to enforce discipline on the bank by the regulator. So in the market disciplining mechanism, participants say, hey, nothing's going to happen. Why should we bother? Credit agencies and auditors are not independent evaluators of risk. Credit agencies are paid by the bank for their rating, at least, and that makes them less independent. Information complexity. No one understands anything about derivatives disclosures. What are they saying? What's the exposure? A lot of it is off balance sheet. Bank managers have no incentive to change behavior. Political cronyism is a reason why bank managers may not have any reason to act on market signals. Non-controlled shareholders. If you're a public sector bank and if you are a non-controlled shareholder, there's a controlled shareholder that is taking care of everything. Why should I bother? That might be a reason why discipline can fail. Shareholders may actually encourage risk-taking because they're more interested in short-term gains as opposed to long-term gains. A discipline. So a lot of that happened actually prior to the financial crisis. There was information available, but markets didn't discipline. In fact, the market bubbled up, as a matter of fact. Next slide, please. In terms of the non-banking financial sector, all I can say is just give one name today, and that's Evergrande in China. Now that's a non-banking financial sector bank, and the markets have already reacted. Their loans, their connections, their systemic risk. They have borrowed money from financial institutions. So we really don't know how this is going to play out. And I think in that sense, today's discussion is extremely timely. Let's not forget that the financial crisis was triggered by the non-banking financial sector. We had Lehman Brothers, AIG, Merrill Lynch, all of those being involved in all this. It's a fast-growing sector of shadow banks. It complements. And to some extent, and this is a researchable topic, to some extent, the existence of the non-banking financial sector may make market discipline in the public sector banks, etc., more robust, actually. I don't know. It might provide some competition. They're systemically important institutions. So, but then there's also the too big to fail issues that go with NBFCs. And in India, if there's an NBFC failure, as we well know, it has an asymmetric impact on small businesses and low-income households and the real estate sector. So there's a lot more than just systemically important. It has real impact on a lot of the population. Perhaps a regulatory body specifically for NBFCs would be useful. And there's no deposit insurance and prudential standards, as I have understood from the Dvara Research. And so will market discipline really be effective in the case of NBFCs? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this specific area. So with that, that's my last slide, please. Thank you. And I welcome questions, and I'll hand it over to Anant at this point. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Niranjan. I think that was a fantastic segue from the Dvara Research and from Madhu's presentation. So, and you did kind of allude to it several times and weaved it in very well. So thank you for that excellent overview. We will take questions towards the end once every panelist has had his or her say. A couple of things which at least come to my mind, which I'd like to ask of you, and we'll come back to you. You make a good point about Evergrande, which is a topical issue at this point in time, and the issue of NBFCs. This implicit issue of too big to fail, or let's say in some cases implicit sovereign guarantees expected. In India we had IL&FS, which was in a way seen to be some kind of blessing, from the government itself. How does one tackle something like this? There is a herd mentality involved in dealing with situations like this, which go on for a long, long time. The party continues until the party stops. How does one tackle something like this? And the second point you made, which is right at the beginning, the point about ex ante versus ex post, is that really doable? Or are we condemned to having a few mistakes as we go along? And the trick is to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistake and we learn from that and move on. How does one strike the balance? The last bit which comes to my mind is, you've seen multiple jurisdictions. You're also familiar with India. What is it that India is good at as far as regulations are concerned, particularly in helping with market discipline? And what is it that India could learn, let's say, from other peer countries? Something which come to mind. I'll leave these thoughts with you, and then I'll move on to the next speaker. So Nandini Vijayaraghavan, again, somebody who straddles, who knows India extremely well. At the same time, also has international experience. In fact, she's sat in Singapore as we speak. Nandini, the floor is yours. Niranjan has set out the agenda extremely well. If you can take a segue from there and see the issue as you see it. The floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, Anand, and thanks Dvara Research for the opportunity, and Madhu, great presentation, setting the stage for this entire panel discussion, and Niranjan for focusing this discussion in the absolutely essential areas. So anyway, when I saw this topic, improving public disclosures, I was reminded of the opening scene in My Fair Lady, where Henry Higgins wonders, why can't the English teach their children how to speak? Arabians learn Arabian with the speed of summer lightning, and the Hebrews learn it backwards, which is absolutely frightening. But use proper English and you're regarded as a freak. So I completely empathize with this view, because when I read NBFC financials in India, I wonder, why do Indian NBFCs masquerade as manufacturing companies? So their business profiles are closer to banks than industrials, yet you seldom get the impression when you look at their profit and loss account and balance sheet and cash flow statement that these organizations actually borrow and lend money, they securitize their portfolios and originate loans for other lenders for a fee. So Ranjita, could you show my presentation and go to slide 2, please? Or slide 3. So how NBFCs report their financials and occasionally their operating performance is emblematic of corporate India's disclosure practices. By corporate India, I mean banks, NBFCs, private sector companies, and public sector enterprises listed. So one way of evaluating disclosures is by analyzing their quality, their frequency, and how they are communicated. Financial institutions and real estate are two industries where financial statements reveal less about a business than a relatively straightforward trading or manufacturing company. So what gives users insights into the business is segment and operating information. So in the case of financials, this would be business-wise performance, industry exposure, their largest exposures, largest NPAs, etc. In the case of property developers, it would be information on the existing stock of properties, new launches, unsold properties, etc. So annual reports have become quite voluminous, reflecting the increasing complexity of the times we live in. They include ESG details, various board committees, all of which are extremely essential, but they have not necessarily become more insightful. Deficiencies in reporting that have persisted for decades in India are yet to be addressed. One such deficiency is the instance of accounting restatements being highlighted. This is very rare. Even more scarce is the provision of pro forma financials. In 2018, ONGC had acquired BPCL. It was one of the largest acquisitions. A non-Indian team member of mine who was reading the financials rushed into my room asking, Nandini, ONGC has doubled its revenues and margins. Why hasn't the media reported it? I highlighted the BPCL acquisition. Pat came the next question. If a Fortune 500 entity like ONGC, whose credit rating is higher than the sovereign, does not provide pro forma financials for the previous year, who will? So rating agency analysts, I have been one before, despair at the limited information on debt profiles. Companies domiciled in countries at a comparable stage of development, Indonesia and the Philippines, report year-wise maturity of debt, the breakup between fixed and floating rate debt, various debt instruments with their outstandings, loans, medium-term notes, non-convertible debentures, applicable interest rates, both in their annual and interim financials. Indian corporates and FIs don't consistently provide such granular information. What is public information in Indonesia and the Philippines is confidential information in India. This is an issue I will revisit at a later point. Yet another curious Indian practice is that the current portion of long-term debt is reported as part of other current financial liabilities and not as part of short-term debt. This may have existed in the UK long ago, I don't know, but the practice still continues in India. This results in those unfamiliar with this practice underreporting debt. Further, not all disclosures have to be part of annual or interim financial reports. In the digital age, banks and NBFCs may make available on a periodic basis their largest counterparties and stressed exposures and NPAs as spreadsheets on their respective websites. This may help minimize the incidence of one lender categorizing a counterparty as a performing asset and another as an NPA. Next slide, please. So the frequency of disclosures is the second aspect in which corporate India does not compare favorably with peers. Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand report standalone and consolidated balance sheet, profit and loss account, and cash flow statement with notes to accounts on a quarterly basis. Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore do so on a semi-annual basis. The costs and benefits of interim report need to be weighed. Singapore moved from quarterly to semi-annual reporting a couple of years ago. Hong Kong only reports headline cash flow statement numbers in its semi-annuals, but the income statement and balance sheet data is detailed enough for us to deduce or compute the cash flow statement. These 7 countries also provide interim operating and segment information. These are practices that India must emulate. The next slide, please. Now, communication of disclosures, in my view, is corporate India's Achilles heel. You still have large companies, blue chips, who replicate the publication of their interim financials in the newspaper as their interim financial statements, both in the website and in the stock exchange disclosures. The PDFs of the annual and interim reports are not searchable. Machine learning platforms are addressing this drawback, but it is at a very slow pace. Hardly any financial institution or corporate provides spreadsheet versions of its financials in its website. Somehow the intent seems to be complying with disclosure norms in letter and not in spirit. So what are the ramifications? Next slide, please. Yeah, so one is franchise risk. You know, having worked in India and now out of Singapore, it pains me when, you know, because of our suboptimal disclosures, reliability of corporate India's reporting is frequently questioned. It's also the sad truth. Second, improved disclosure would attract more FDI if the experiences of China, Hong Kong, and Singapore are anything to go by. If you look at the bar chart I have included on the right-hand side, you know, China and Hong Kong have independently reported exponential increases in their FDI, and so has Singapore. Singapore's data has to be viewed with the understanding that the country serves as a gateway both to Indonesia and Malaysia. There are Indonesian and Malaysian corporates which are listed on the Singapore exchange, you know, for either tax or reputation benefits. So, but still, and India is a very, very distant third. So, of course, it is also our infrastructure, our ease of doing business, and our high corporate tax rates. We are the second highest after Brazil amongst the BRICS and ASEAN countries in terms of corporate tax rates, even after the recent cut. So all those are contributory factors as well. But if you look at China and Hong Kong, if with comparable ease of doing business and better reporting and lower tax rates, they have, I suppose, attracted much more FDI. So, and the third is an issue I had alluded to earlier. What is public information in other countries is material non-public information in India. This includes, but is not limited to, organization structure, operating performance, and debt profile. Deepti George and I had co-authored a paper on improving outcomes for the financial system through credit rating agencies in 2019. It is available on the Dvara Research blog. In this paper, we mentioned that rating agencies use both public information and material non-public information to assign credit ratings. The higher the reliance on non-public information in assigning ratings, the fewer insights ratings have for end users. This is an industry that's globally characterized by conflict of interest due to the remuneration structure and accused of reacting to rather than anticipating developments. Do we have to add another layer of inefficiency in India due to poor disclosures? Next slide, please. So what is the way forward? A couple of suggestions. RBI, SEBI, the CA Institute, and the National Financial Reporting Authority need to collaborate to systematically align the Indian GAAP and the Ind AS with the relevant global best practices. There should be meaningful interim reporting. I can, in one-to-one conversations, tell you of PDFs uploaded where the previous year's interim is entirely cut off. The quality is really, really poor and it's low resolution. And these are large cap corporates, and also set standards for communicating annual and interim operating and financial performance. Operating and financial performance go hand in hand, and that is something which needs, the regulators need to impress upon, and investors need to impress upon our corporates. And probably creating a platform for investors, bankers, journalists, analysts to rank the quality of listed companies' disclosures would exercise some soft pressure, and there's more compliance in spirit rather than just letter. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nandini. Again, a very, very comprehensive set of comments. In the interest of time, I'll move on, but a few questions which I guess come to my mind. You made the point about NBFCs masquerading as corporates. I'd love to hear our next speaker, Harsh, his take on this particular topic. And I know he has some views on this as well. On the point about, credit rating agencies working with incomplete data or data which is treated as public elsewhere but private in India. I wonder if there is a onus on rating agencies as well to illustrate or to actually clearly list out as to what the shortcomings in the data available is, so that everybody is aware of what the issues are. I do see inadequate disclosures when it comes to rating agencies, and full disclosure, I'm on the board of a rating agency as well. Interesting point about FDI, and to the point that Niranjan made about Evergrande. I do wonder if it's a quality of disclosures which is the deciding factor. You did make the point about infrastructure, etc. But I do think, I guess the way I would frame that is, how does India compare with jurisdictions like China or Malaysia or Indonesia when it comes to disclosure standards? You mentioned some of them. Are there some good points? Are there some bad points? Would be a great question. And to the point about getting SEBI, etc., to come together and decide on making sure that we're best in class and we learn from our peers. I wonder if there is a mechanism already in place, and is that have you seen evidence of some discussions with regulators, etc., where at least they're seeking out information on what they could do better? But again, this is something which I'm sure Harsh can address as well. Harsh, you're on next. Thanks a lot for your patience. But look forward to a perspective which is a combination of being an expert practitioner as well as somebody who researches this topic extensively, besides having the ears of the regulator. So all yours, Harsh. You're on mute, Harsh.
Okay, sorry. So a lot of good stuff has already been said. So I'm going to speak what I call marginal issues. So one thing, I divide disclosures into two parts. One are regulatory disclosures, which is what we are focusing on. There are voluntary disclosures. Quarterly analyst presentations are not mandatory, but most listed large banks make them, and they are fairly extensive. Let me focus on regulatory disclosures first. What we have in India, we have multiplicity of regulators. Every vertical, it's a very siloed regulatory structure. We have the RBI, the SEBI, the IRDA, the pension regulator, and so on and so forth. And you have to bear in mind that RBI as a financial sector regulator makes very limited public disclosure requirement. It asks a ton of information for itself, but very little of that gets put in the public domain, and bulk of, all of it, as far as I know, is annual. There is no high frequency data that RBI demands that companies put, even listed banks put. So effectively, RBI has outsourced the high frequency data to SEBI. Unfortunately, SEBI takes a uniform approach. For them, companies that make ice cream, t-shirts, steel, and banks are all the same. So they will. So, for example, listing requirement do not require banks to disclose balance sheet on a quarterly basis. Many banks do it, but out of goodness of their heart, not because it's required. They only require income statement. And as we all know, income statements for banks on a quarterly basis are completely bogus. Once I got an analyst to take a sample of banks and add their quarterly provisioning and profits to annual number, and we got two very interesting outcomes. For some banks, it matched to a second degree of decimal, which worried me. And some banks, there was a 20% difference, which also worried me. So effectively, what we have is a disclosure on a quarterly basis, which is a listing requirement. It's not a financial regulatory requirement, which means unlisted entities get excused. And also it gets driven by what effectively it does is, my view, that it privileges one class of those market disciplinarians, namely institutional investors, who have the wherewithal to actually go through this to figure this out. It does. I don't know how many depositors actually read quarterly results or understand, even worse. So I think that is the issue for us now. Dvara's report was, I think, very kind. So, for example, they said that we score high on comparability. I tried to compare the disclosures on the loan books of two banks. Now, the problem is that they give rating mix. There is no basis to figure out AAA for one bank is the same as AAA for another bank. In fact, AAA for one rating agency is not the same. Anant, you would know this, for AAA of another agency. And we have prescribed no regulatory standards on this. In fact, SEBI has basically have a circular which says, Dipti knows this, which defines what should be default probability of AAA and AA. Beyond that, they've stopped. RBI has no such thing. So RBI leaves it to bank to define what they are going to call AAA. So what we have is that, and by the way, this is not irrelevant, because for a AAA rated paper, the capital requirement is lower. So we are in some way sanctioning regulatory these ratings that banks are doing without any basis for. So if two banks disclose their portfolio, there is no way of comparing it. So what is comparable are the parameters that are prescribed. How they are measured and disclosed is not comparable at all. It's not timely, as Dvara report also mentions. In fact, I asked one bank. Dvara report talked about the PV01, which is change in securities portfolio value for one basis point increase or decrease in interest rate. I asked similar information about change in credit rating. So, for example, what will happen to the corporate bond book of a bank if there was a one-notch decrease in the credit rating? They said they don't have the information. They certainly don't disclose it, but they didn't claim that they didn't even have it. So there are just lots and lots of gaps, and I think the reason for this, to my mind, is our heritage of, if you will, government-owned banking. Anant, you made this point. We have such an overwhelming 2/3 of the banking sector is owned by government. Who cares what the disclosure is? In late 1990s, Indian Bank for 4 or 5 years ran with negative net worth, not inadequate capital. They had negative capital and still had very healthy credit growth and also deposit growth. So my view is that when we have this overwhelming presence of implicit sovereign guarantee, these disclosures become not so relevant. So finally, what is the one quick fix would be for the regulators. So, for example, I don't have a problem with RBI says, look, SEBI's quarterly disclosure is going to be what I'm happy with. So as long as the banks that I regulate or NBFCs comply with SEBI. But then the least that could be done is that they sit together and define common standards. So AAA bond must have the same default probability as a AAA loan across agencies, etc., including IRD. One interesting, I once asked one insurance regulator, I said, so how do you define NPAs in an insurance book, loan book? So very gingerly, I got to say the same as RBI. And I could make out that the person wasn't very sure. And my problem was that when banks were disclosing huge amounts of NPAs, insurers had pristine loan books or the bond books. So we have all these kind of lack of comparability across regulators. So the simplest way would be for them to sit together and define common standards. But as I often say that our regulators are sovereign nations who have no diplomatic relationship with each other. So I don't see this happening anytime soon. And finally, I think, let me spend a minute on voluntary disclosure. So what we have seen a fair bit of improvement over the last few years, last decade or so, is the voluntary disclosures that certainly large listed banks make on their quarters. That just tells you that if there is investor pressure, there could be actually better disclosures. There is clear evidence of market discipline working. It's just that it doesn't work uniformly. I will stop there.
Hey, thanks again, Harsh. I knew fireworks would happen, but this was even better than I expected. So thank you. So you set up the stage very nicely for Naren. But a few things which come to my mind basis your comments. Again, fantastic comments. One is this point about RBI asking for tons of data and then hoarding it with themselves. Thank God Mr. Vishwanathan is not here to beat us up. But it extends to other things as well. For instance, rating agencies, and Nandini mentioned this. Bank loan default data is not available with rating agencies, even though bond.
Absolutely not. So Anand, sorry, can I make a point? I was in my notebook, but I missed. So the last point I wanted to mention is the regulatory disclosures itself, the disclosure that the regulators make. So we have this wonderful financial stability report, which comes after 6 months of things having happened. And it is aggregated omnibus level, which actually tells you nothing other than saying this whole amorphous construct called the banking system is robust. I mean, that tells me nothing. It says 2 out of 100 scheduled commercial banks are in trouble. We don't know which those 2 are and how much trouble they are in. So I think one sort of the other side of the coin is also the amount of disclosures the RBI could make or all other regulators could make, just in terms of, and I make this point all the time, post the crisis, US Fed and even UK regulator have been doing stress tests on and are putting entity level results in public domain. They will say this bank is in trouble or in so much trouble. Now there are downsides to it. We can manage them, can give some time lag and so on. RBI is nowhere close to doing that. Sorry.
That was exactly the point I was going to make as well, that we are not told which banks fail stress tests. But I don't know the answer to this, Harsh. You made your views very clear. But I remember a senior regulator once telling me that there is a thin line between transparency and nudity, and don't cross that line. So it's a nice discussion point, which we can put up later on. The point you make about regulatory coordination.
Anand, sorry. The sovereign is the Lord Krishna in the Vastrandad. It keeps providing clothes. So there is no problem with nakedness.
Yeah, the problem is if it's not owned by the sovereign, but it's a good point, Harsh. I'm with you on, by the way, if you ask me my personal view. The point about regulatory coordination, I think, is a very, very strong one. It's not just about market disciplining. I think it extends to other areas as well, where sometimes our regulators could be seen as being a lot more coordinated in their actions. And absolutely, I think I love the comment you made about the Dvara Research being kind. Madhu, there's feedback for you. Don't be so kind. But again, great comments, Harsh. We'll come back to you with a ton of questions. Last but not the least, Naren, you are the guy who's supposed to do the market disciplining, empowered by all the suggestions made by the previous panelists. So tell us, as a market participant yourself and one of the most respected ones, what's your take on this whole subject, man?
So it's tough to talk after all the gurus have spoken, who are much more research, who have done very good research. But see, our experience, my experience after being in the markets for more than 3 decades has been very interesting. That disclosures keep increasing and the quantum of disclosures keep increasing. But it doesn't help at some points of time. So you take all the problems that happened in the financial system in 2019-20, which most of us are aware about. Did all the disclosures help? The answer is no. There was fair amount of disclosures. You had Big Four audits. You had quarterly conference calls. You had quarterly analysts. You had so many sell-side prominent brokers giving buy and sell recommendations. But all the problems when they emanated, I don't think people managed to predict it before. So I wonder, why did it happen? Like, if you ask me, as an investment house managing other people's money, we were cautious way before. And people used to say that there's something wrong with us, that we were very cautious. Say every quarter, some of those institutions which got into trouble used to come and tell us that, please look at us, we are fine. And they would come and tell everyone around also that there's something wrong with us, that we are not considering them. And but finally it happened. And why did we get it right? It was basically skepticism, and I would say the ability to take pain. That we will not invest in this paper, saying that there seems to be a risk, because no one can do magic in India. They cannot lend and get back money from the most dangerous borrowers, as though there is magic. And it worked finally. But if it had not worked, maybe you wouldn't have called me, you would have called the people who did the magic. So that is the situation. Take today, for example, everyone knows there are problems in the microfinance industry. How many companies are showing the problems today? There is enough disclosure capability. And the reality is, Reserve Bank has a ton of information, SMA 0, SMA 1, SMA 2. So how could the Reserve Bank also help the entire financial system? Because actually they gave the right signals, if you ask me. The right signals were given in a very subtle way by Reserve Bank in 2017-18, and we took those signals beautifully. And we took those signals and said, this is proof. But the fact is that, was that proof? No, it was not. But we just took it as proof and moved on and said our gut is now sure. So I'm saying, like, today in microfinance, there could be something similar happening, and we don't know which are those entities. Again, we'll go on this cold skeptical model because disclosures are there. But will the quality of disclosures be good? No, only when the problem hits the floor, you will know whose quality of disclosure is good and whose quality is bad. And that is the challenge. And people, even rating agencies failed in the 2017 to 20 period. And that was the beauty, that they need not have failed, even they failed. So, so this is the challenge, I would say, as a user and as a person who has to manage other people's money, that rating agencies fail, something which is AAA defaults. And there is disclosure, but the disclosure doesn't help us. So this is the challenge. And I worry today, now you have these fintechs, and people say these fintechs are going to get listed at billions of dollars market cap. They don't even have earnings. At least some of these companies had earnings. Now these companies are not even going to have earnings. And without earnings, they are going to get listed at billions of dollars market cap. So maybe the problem will not be in credit markets. The problem will move from credit markets to equity markets. And I'm involved in equities also. So I will have to bear that problem in equities. Again, how early can you be skeptical? And if you're wrong by years, you may lose your job. So the challenge is there again for us. Can we be skeptical 3 years in advance, like what happened in credit, and we still saved our job? Can we be 3 years skeptical ahead in some of these fintechs and save our jobs? Or what will happen? These are questions for which there are no answers. So what happens is, more and more in India, disclosures get added. More and more things get added. But when quality of disclosure fails, there is not enough penalty. And that is the heart of the problem, if you ask me, not the disclosures per se. And that is my learning. And so what happens when we are managing other people's money? The view we have taken is be skeptical, take pain. So this is the model that we have decided to take, and be cautious. So this is the model that we have taken for our, because when we manage large amounts of other people's money, this is the model we have taken. And this model has worked for us. But at some point of time, people will say this is always a skeptical person and a skeptical organization. But that's a call that we have taken. This is how I look at it.
So I think, Naren, in your short intervention that you made, I must have counted the word skeptical some 68 times. Yeah. So it kind of summarizes the sum and substance of your take. But here is my first question to you, and I'm going to start with you, Naren. The point you're making about the need to stay skeptical as a market participant, and you're handling tons and tons of money, you're handling lakhs of crores of rupees of investor money. That tells me that you're still not confident about the quality of the disclosures. You're talking about a lot of disclosures, but not enough about the trust or the quality of the disclosures. Here's my first question to you. You mentioned 2017, 18, 20, the fact that during ILFS, we all had a shock. DHFL didn't help. Have things improved from there? The question I was asking Niranjan earlier, which is that, yes, ideally, you should solve these problems before they happen. But once the problems happen, did you see SEBI, RBI, the ecosystem, and the point that Nandini was making as well, that all of them should come together and do things? Have you seen that happen so that we will not have another ILFS, we will not have another DHFL coming up and shocking all of us?
Actually, I have a very controversial point here. See, the point is that in credit, people have stopped taking risk. So is that beneficial for the country that we just stop taking risk? Is it, if you look at the amount of papers where we were taking risk in the 2017-18 as ICICI Prudential, which was much higher. So today we just stop taking risk. So if we simply say that we'll give money only to AAA and to AA, does it help the country? Because I believe that we have a better capability to take single A than many other entities in the country. But we have just stopped taking single A because of what has happened in 17, 18, 20. Instead, we are taking risk in all the investors of India are taking risk in something which I would call triple B, double B, single B in equity. And
sorry to interrupt, but here's my point to you. And you're right. People like you and the team that you have, you're absolutely capable of going down the credit chain, and you'll do a good job of it. What stops you? Now, my question is, do you not trust the numbers coming out from those people? Or is it that the regulations have to change and you need a little more disclosures of the kind that, for instance, Nandini was mentioning? Is that what is required? What is stopping you from doing it now?
I think Harsh can also add, the system does not want us to take single A paper. But
Absolutely,
the system wants us
absolutely.
to take equity, which is equal to single B or almost equal to default grade in equity. But in debt, they don't want us to take even single A. But in equity, they want us to take the equivalent of single D.
Excellent. So, Harsh, please come in, Harsh.
Yeah, I mean, single A below risk is being taken by AI, if at all. I mean, mutual funds, a lot of the debt money is institutional money who want to run it as a treasury operation, who wants to take credit risk there. I wrote an article called A Decade of Credit Collapse in India. We are at a 6-decade low on credit growth. And this, I mean, another very interesting thing is if you look at government-owned paper. So you look at NHAI, whose SPVs will not even on the standalone basis get a single B rating, get better than corporate AAA pricing because of this, and there is no explicit government guarantee. So we have completely screwed up debt market. The problem also is rating agencies. I mean, I think the one aftermath of ILFS was that nobody trusts in ratings, especially below single A.
Sure. But Harsh, let me ask you the same question which I asked Naren. Do you see things having improved since 2017, 18, 19 after all the mishaps which happened? Have the regulators learned? Have the quality of disclosures improved? Have the requirements of making more frequent, more reliable disclosures, have they helped? Do you see that at least that being addressed?
No, I don't think so. I think what has happened is the system has become much more risk averse.
Okay.
So I think people, I mean, as Naren was saying, bankers don't touch risk with a barge pole now. And no, not is the bond market. So therefore, the spreads between even a single A and a triple A have widened a lot. We've seen that, right? I mean, I don't think that's the right reaction, but that's what the reaction has been.
Okay, I'm going to come to Dr. Chipalkatti now because I'm conscious that he has to go for a trek tomorrow morning, and I would like to release him as at least. By the way, he's been extremely efficient. There was a question which came up in the Q&A which he's already answered. So thank you for that, Niranjan. Really appreciate. That question was also addressed to Nandini. In case you want to add some comments to that, please go ahead. Niranjan, the question for you really. You talked about Evergrande a couple of times, and even in India, we had a couple of too big to fail or quasi-sovereign kind of names, which are seen as being backed by really big people and therefore can't fail. And Naren is actually right. Some people stopped dealing with ILFS many, many years ago, but the residual people who dealt with ILFS went on till the music stopped, which was sometime in 2018 September. So the question I have to you is, with all the disclosures or with all the lack of disclosures and the obvious lack of disclosures, if you see the point you made about a kind of a too big to fail or a quasi-sovereign guarantee or a godfather who will take care or godmother who will take care, how does one address that kind of a risk? Because I'm sure that's there in many emerging markets where you have, quasi-sovereign kind of entities or really large, powerful people who back entities, and you're supposed to go with the flow. Otherwise, you stand out, as Naren says, as somebody who's not with it and kind of losing out some easy money. How does one address that?
That's a very difficult question, and therein lies the political economy of what we are talking about here. And the answer to that is political will, I guess. In so many ways, it's does the ruling party, if you will, blink or not blink? And right now, as I was just checking the news, as far as I know, the Chinese government has not said anything about coming up to help Evergrande. So there you go. And immediately the markets have reacted. So we don't know whether that is going to persist or not, because it is, apparently there are systemic connections with the other institutions. So one is political will, but apart from that, I mean, you can talk of having convertible bonds is one way people say that having bonds that convert when certain reserve requirements are not met or certain financial conditions, stability conditions are not met, capital adequacy standards are not met. That's another way of doing it. Having an oversight board which coordinates the actions, and I think it was Harsh who mentioned it about multiplicity of regulators. So there should be an oversight board that coordinates the actions of everyone. Loan loss provisioning, and instead of waiting for 90 days before you decide, oops, wait a minute, the loan is not going to be, the money is not going to come back, maybe having the expected credit functionality, and especially in emerging markets, they have been slow to pick up on that standard. Why emerging markets? Let's not just stand here and pick those markets. It's true for all markets. Okay, there's been a lot of resistance to the new ECL standards. So I think, in my judgment, that's pretty much it. That in terms of the too big to fail modality, breaking up banks. That's what they're talking about out here. For example, for Wells Fargo, breaking it up. It's become too big, and I don't know about that, because again, that brings in political will, antitrust, and things like that. So, so no easy answer.
No easy answer.
Can I make a point?
Please.
In bond market, I made this suggestion for which I was just being short of being murdered. So I said, when you have these sovereign,
plenty of reasons why you're going to be murdered. So it's okay. One more.
I know there is a contract out on me by many people. So I said, look, when you have sovereign entities, why doesn't SEBI say you disclose two ratings? Standalone rating if it was not government owned, and the rating when it is government owned. I was heckled out of the room because I said some of them will not even get a single B if they were standalone, but they get a triple A pricing. So these are not regulatory actions, but I don't know what prevents this SEBI from doing this. Just say that disclosed. This is a classic example of a good disclosure. That if this entity, if NHI, this SPV is not owned by the government, it will get a rating of C+. But it is owned by the central government directly, so they are going to give it AAA+ or whatever it is.
Nandini, you have to come in. Your ex-rating agency yourself, please come in.
Yes, thank you. globally, rating agencies do make a distinction between standalone and supported ratings. And they would say standalone ratings is X, and then it is upgraded by Y notches to get the final or supported rating of Z. So
it's just that there is no explicit support here.
Right. So in Ireland FS, I have to speak about Ireland FS. Since 2014, the profits of Ireland FS, I mean, people say it's complex, it's a conglomerate, it has more than 100 operating subsidiaries, and so it was not possible to find out what a mess Ireland FS has got into it. I completely disagree. The financials are there in the public domain. You'll see from 2014, profits had dipped and the entity had turned loss-making. Despite that, the company was paying dividends out. And in the last year, financial year 2018, when profits had, or the losses had hit its nadir, was the maximum dividend payout, and dividend was paid out of capital for at least 3 years. Now, had the rating agencies said that this is the standalone rating, and by virtue of LIC and State Bank of India being the standard shareholders, I'm taking a weighted average rating of all the controlling shareholders and assigning this final rating, they would have redeemed themselves. But just by publishing the final rating, they got themselves rightly into the mess. So there are a set of better practices rating agencies outside India follow, and we have 3 rating agencies in India which are subsidiaries of S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And once again, it would be great since the rating agencies haven't done it by themselves to adopt the practices of their shareholders, for the regulator to commission a study and do it.
So I'm going to very quickly add on to this. The good news is, and I'm privy to some of those discussions, there is a representation which has gone to SEBI, stating exactly what you wanted, Harsh, and what you're suggesting, Nandini, which is that at least in the press release which accompanies the rating decision outcome, there will be a differentiation between a standalone rating and a notched up rating because of whether it's an implicit support or an explicit support or whatever it is. By the way, there isn't consensus on this, and the regulator herself hasn't decided, but the discussion has definitely started.
Anand, be aware, all dealing rooms will do a dharna in BKC.
Yeah, so there's suparis on me as well, so don't worry about that. But on a related topic, I'm going to come to, in fact, I'm going to open this to everybody, and I want everybody's views on this. But here's a broad issue. The regulator, we talked about disclosures and therefore empowering market participants to discipline the financial services ecosystem. Under certain circumstances, especially the Indian regulator has provided forbearances from disclosures and has provided forbearances from adequate provisioning as well. Okay. So even today, as we speak, when it comes to micro, small and medium enterprise loans, what we call mudra loans specifically, there are forbearances on giving out the true nature of what non-performing assets actually lie there. Certain class of real estate loans similarly have certain forbearances as well. Interestingly, even on the provisioning norms, so the requirements are pretty much regulated. So you actually have 15% for the first year of a non-performing asset,
in
40%, and after 4 years it becomes 100%. So while you would assume that that's the minimum that the regulator is asking for, in effect it becomes a diktat, and then every bank says, "Oh, I've done 15%, which is the regulatory requirement." So my point is, in many ways, and when you, I'm guessing that the regulator is also worried that if you disclose too much, you could set off an unnecessary panic. I'm not saying I agree with that line of thinking. All I'm saying is that could be a point in the back of the people's minds. My question to you, and Nandini to you, and to Niranjan to you, is from an international perspective. Is this something that you see in almost every jurisdiction where you have forbearances around disclosures, etc.? And especially, for instance, when we had COVID, when a lot of companies went through, in the hospitality industry and in the contact services, when they went through tough times, do you provide forbearances for recognition of bad loans in those sectors? And my question to, I guess, Naren and Harsh would be, would you recommend, and you think the Indian market is mature enough to understand, full disclosures without having it being sugar-coated by such regulatory dispensation? Anybody can go. Please raise your hand and go ahead.
I could start.
Yes, please,
I mean,
please, doctor, please go ahead.
Yeah, definitely there is no forbearances, if I understand you correctly, in terms of limitations of what you would do for loan loss provisioning. No, absolutely not. And in fact, the flip is true that there's a lot of assessment of whether banks have adequately provided for by looking at all sorts of metrics to predict the loan loss provisions and seeing the difference between the expectation and the actuality. So no, and I don't think it is the business of the regulator to be laying standards on such things. I think that is the judgment of the bank and its governance, the audit committee and folks like that to decide that. Of course, but that opens it up to management, earnings management out there. So you cannot, there is no straight answer for everything. There's a cost benefit out there. And if you're predominantly looking at a market-based disciplining mechanism, then you have to let information be disclosed. There should not be any forbearance. In fact, that is almost like the too big to fail in its micro essence, isn't it? So I don't agree with that policy.
It is in India. Sorry, Harsh, please go ahead. And then after that.
Yeah, so I think there's a good news here and there's not so good news. So if you look at the forbearance in early 2010s, we had a whole series of 4-5 years of that. There was no disclosures. Compared to that, last year's scheme had a much better level of disclosure. So I think we generally directionally moved in the right direction. And that's exactly because of that early 2010s forbearance, it ended up in the AQR, where RBI has to come down. Look, and I'm not saying this jokingly, RBI's role model is Lord Krishna. They have to keep throwing clothing at these banks to hide them. And then when they go to battle, they have to narrate the Bhagavad Gita. That's the way RBI operates. So I think, and a part of it is that a large percentage of it is government owned. So ultimately, RBI is the agent of the government. So they can't let these banks be laid bare, in front of everybody. So I think, and I don't think I'm going to change anytime soon.
Thanks, Harsha. Nandini, you had your hand up, please.
Yeah. So I agree with Niranjan. In Singapore, there was no forbearance, and banks instead disclosed the incremental asset slippage because of COVID and the incremental provisioning, and how things have now started to moderate with the economy opening up, etc. And I think that's the right way to go forward.
Thanks, Nandini. Naren, I'm going to come to you with the market question now. If you were to be academic about it, and I'm using the word in a different way, and insist that every bank has to figure out what is the right level of provisioning for every asset, and no forbearances for COVID or no forbearances for mudra loans or for real estate loans and so on and so forth. So say it as it is, laid bare. And therefore, the CET1 or the capital required comes below regulatory standards. A bank goes into PCA, and all of those nice things happen. Markets will take it adversely. What is your take as a market participant? You heard the academic view. By the way, I agree with the academic view. But what do you, as a market participant, what is your take on this?
It's somehow, other than government ownership, I think the deposit markets get frightened despite whatever Reserve Bank has done in the last 3-4 years in all the entities which failed. I think deposit markets get very frightened. That is the challenge actually that Reserve Bank has at this point of time. And that's why the board of all these entities also, they are very happy of obfuscating everything as they can, as much as they can in every issue. And then they make all the equity investors even more confused. So, but the reality is, luckily, capital is still being available. So I'm looking for a period where equity capital is not available. I and Harsh keep discussing that period, if we ever reach a period where equity capital is not available for these institutions, that would be a very difficult period. If you look at bulk of the period last decade, even when entities have gone into trouble and they have obfuscated all their books, they have managed to raise equity. And this is against what Harsh and I have believed, but they have managed to raise equity, and that is the positive. I am worried about a scenario sometime in future where they are not able to raise equity. Then I think we are headed for deep trouble. Now what they do, they obfuscate issues, then they do one QIP, then they get some private equity person in. Somehow they have managed it.
No, but Naren, sorry. There are also, I mean, look at LVB and DBS. I mean, RBI is good at doing arranged marriages also. LVB would not have, it was out to raise capital, it could not. Hard truth is. One day RBI found a way of doing it, right? So I am saying that the regulator has multiple tools to actually deal with these situations.
Okay. I'm going to summarize the way you did, Harsh, which is, I think, and I take your point, compared to where we were 10 years ago or 8 years ago, pre-AQR, I think things have improved dramatically. Yes, we do have forbearances, but hopefully they're much smaller than they were in the bad old days. We do have norms which are still not insistent on correct provisioning, but provisioning ratios have improved dramatically for the banking and the NBFC system quite a bit. So things have improved in that sense. So maybe it's a step-by-step process, like Naren is saying. And to your point, Naren, about not enough equity, looking by the subscriptions that keep coming into your mutual fund industry as a whole, that day looks a little far away, but who knows? Who the hell knows? I'm going to take a few questions from the audience because they've been very patient out here. Indradeep has a very, very good question, which is, what fundamentally is the quality of disclosure? Is it the extent to which disclosure is able to offer us a moral perspective on the economic value? I'm going to add a twist to Indradeep and butcher his question a little bit. Naren, starting with you, I've often seen the situation where you have two financial sector companies which have very, very similar results. Similar
different valuation,
similar capital structure, similar NPAs, similar net NPAs, similar return on equity, and all of that. And yet you give one of them 5 times book value, and the other one you give half time a book value. What gives? What is it that it seems to be something about the quality of disclosure, as Indradeep points out, that helps you differentiate and be so cruel to one and so generous to the other. Tell us about this. How do you put a number on this, or how do you define this quality of disclosure?
It's past faith in the numbers and how they have seen through cycles. And as you go through one cycle, and if they turn out to be good, one down cycle, I think slowly you will start giving the much better valuation to the same company. I think it's a slow process, and it's not going to be an overnight process. And some companies, and we see, for example, regional banks, they're having such a difficult trouble to get re-rated to a positive level in this environment, because people are questioning in this fintech world what is their new role. So India does not have a small consolidated financial services sector. It has a wide sector, and that challenge exists at this point of time. And having to give credit, India has a very much more efficient sector than many other countries in the world from a customer point of view.
Sure.
But this conversation we have had today is not from a customer point of view. We have had this conversation from a disclosure point of view. But from a customer point of view, today payments are free, credit cards are available for anyone with a decent credit score. All those things are much. You can get a home loan if you have got a reasonable credit score. So at least for people with reasonable credit score, which is not for the unbanked and those kind of people, I think India has created a very efficient financial system for that set of people. I'm not talking about microfinance customers and that set of people, but for others. And I think that is not part of today's conversation.
So Harsh, I'm going to come to you next because you raised your hand. But Naren,
yeah.
I was hoping to hear you say that the trust in the numbers that are coming out have improved over the last couple of years. I still haven't heard you say that, but I'm going to try my one more time before the conversation ends. And you're shaking your head vigorously, which is not helpful. Harsh, over to you, man.
Yeah, so I think there is a deeper, somewhat academic point that I want to make, Anant here, which is that, look, the modern double entry accounting system was not designed for financial entities. It was designed for manufacturing thing. It has been kind of retrofitted to. That's why I always believe things like notions like profits and all are not very easily applicable to bank. I mean, you might have put out a NPA day one and you still keep booking income on it for the next 2 years or whatever number of years. My view is that the single useful metric of measuring a bank performance is the change in its market value of equity between 2 periods. And now how do you get to that is all matter of opinion. So there is a fundamental problem in actually reading financial information about financial disclosure about financial entities. That said, I think globally, I've always used to find that insurance regulators do a better job of doing that than banking, where there's a lot more emphasis on actually market value of capital and so on and so forth. There might be some learning there.
Thanks. Niranjan and Nandini, I'm going to come to you with the next question from Deepthi, which again, I think is a fantastic question. How can we get more investor pressure for better quality of disclosures? And again, I'm going to add a caveat to that or a corollary to that question, which is, in your experience, how do you see this improving? Does it happen always with regulator taking the first step? Or have you also seen situations where the ecosystem outside of the regulator steps up and says, you know what, we demand more information, we demand more disclosures for you to be able to survive with this industry? So some lights on this, some thoughts on this from your international experience would be super useful. Nandini, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so it would be great if the regulators, provided the basic framework for the frequency and quality of reporting. And but at the same time, we do have a lot of whistleblowers in India whose voices have not been heard, through various crises. So, and of course, it is wrong to compare a country as vast as India to a city-state like Singapore. But what I quite liked about one organization called the Small Investors Association of Singapore is that the employees, the management team and the employees there, whenever there's a significant development which positively or adversely affects the investors, they could it could be shareholders, it could be bondholders, they step in, educate the investors, and they also negotiate on behalf of those investors. And we have some excellent whistleblowers and some way of channeling their skills and their commitment for the benefit of the wider investment community would be great. So how this can be done, I don't have ideas as of now, but that I think ought to be done.
Thanks, Nandini. Niranjan?
So, sure. Thank you. And I must apologize. The quality of my internet is poor, so I every once in a while get some breakup in my reception. So, I don't know why that's happening. But be that as it may, an example of investors putting forward disclosure requirements is right now what we're seeing with ESG disclosures. I mean, a lot of that is driven by investors demanding that information from companies. And now there is a global push for example, there's a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board that has come up in the United States. There's GRI standards that are being imposed. There is investor pressure for disclosures that does come about, and the reporting standards change. That's point number one. Point number two, and this is to pick up on a point that Harsh mentioned, is if you look at it from and actually to address sort of Deepti's and Indradeep's question, if you look at it from the perspective of the controlled shareholder in the case of a lot of banks, the RBI is literally acting as the agent of the controlled shareholder in some way. And as far as the controlled shareholder is concerned, the quality of disclosure are excellent. it's the non-controlling or the minority interests, if you will, who are having the problems. And that's true for all controlled shareholding versus minority shareholding, right? So I guess the answer to that is some sort of an independence between the controlled shareholder and the agent that is regulating the disclosure. And that's a tough statement to make, because what does that mean? In essence, then, is point number 3 is where there should be independence and perhaps a robust discussion between, I mean, accounting standards, for example, are not set by the regulator. They come about through a process of the auditors, the accountants, the investors, the institutional investors put pressure, and then the regulator reacts to that. It's not the regulator knows best, and it's not top down that is happening. I suspect a lot of the quality of disclosures will improve as you start increasing or you privatize a lot of the banks and you increase more competition for funds. I think it was Nandini who talked about FDI to banks and, to economies. And the more you privatize, the more you improve disclosure. So the more there's a pull for funds, capital, and there's more of an incentive for that, the better will be the quality of disclosures. But to the point that Naren and Harsh mentioned, liquidity has been sloshing around the world for the last decade. So there has been no incentive really to change that, because you get fintech, you get money just, hey, who cares about profits? You're waiting for the next best widget, right? So fintech is a scary aspect of disclosures, and I don't know what that means to all of us.
So Naren gave the exact same fear as well about lack of cash flows, etc. That's a nice segue to the next question, which actually Madhu has put up there. If I summarize the question the way I read it, the fact is, as you said, Professor Chipalkatti, because there's so much liquidity, and by the way, now a lot of that liquidity is going out as M1 money supply. It's going in the hands of people in current accounts and savings accounts, so which are now searching for assets to put in. And therefore, retail participation in risky assets, whether it's Bitcoins, whether it's real estate, whether it's equity markets, is going through the roof. Now, in a situation like this, where it's no longer the savvy big boy or big girl investor, but it's also my mother, who's now 82 years old, looking to enhance her return and beat very, very sharply negative real rates of interest. Does the regulatory approach towards disclosure and buyer beware need to change from where it is right now? Anybody can take this question. Professor, it'd be great if we can take it, or anybody can jump in. Because there's so much of retail participation, and as you said, there's a plethora of information coming in, including around ESG. The annual reports now go into hundreds of pages. How do we make sure that the small retail participant is still taken care of?
That's, I think that I know in the case of United States, I rely a lot on the agency of the institutional investor to discipline the markets and then to filter out that information, or financial journalists to provide the exposés and that information. But having said that, I was just reading, for example, and I don't mean to use that example all the time, but Evergrande, for example, did not get a going concern qualification from its auditor, even though it was PwC, they were using Hong Kong standards, etc. So, and a lot of retail investors, as you put it, Anand, are going to pay the price for that. So I think that is truly a very difficult question, because not everyone understands accounting. Not everyone will pick up a financial statement and read through it. It's not an easy read. So you need a robust credit rating agency, a robust set of rating financial analyst community. You need robust intervention by institutional investors. Corporate governance is perhaps the most important aspect of it. Independent a financial committee on the board is particularly important. it's the whole system. There is no one answer. And for a retail investor, I don't have an easy answer for that.
Anand,
Please go ahead.
I don't think disclosures are going to improve retail investors' life. I mean, come on, you and I don't understand bank balance sheet, and we spent 30, 40 years doing that. I think the best option to retail investor to give their money to Naren or somebody like him. He can hire 2 more analysts to read these 100,000 page annual reports and make better informed investment. That's the way I think capital markets ought to work. If retail investors have too much liquid money that the government has thrown at them, they want to play in risk asset, I don't think it's the regulator's job to rescue them. I mean, no, and certainly no amount of disclosure improvement is going to help that. In fact, if anything, it's going to confuse them even more. So I don't think that should be our guiding light.
Yeah. On that note,
one worry I have, Anand, 2 lakh crores is the open interest in stock futures in India today. Yeah. Every day, 10 lakh crores of stock option trading happens daily in India today. 10 lakh crores. And, as mutual funds, we don't have even 1,000 crores maybe of buy futures in stock futures. So the entire 2 lakh crores of stock futures is not held by mutual funds, I feel.
And it's all by day traders. Yeah.
Day traders. So I worry about it because I don't know what they know. That 10 lakh crore of option trading, I don't know what they know. I worry about it.
Hey, Naren, this is online casino, man.
Yeah. So by the way, Deepthi just put on a video. I think she's here to discipline us so that we don't go beyond the time. But I have one question to ask, which I can't resist from asking. And Nandini, this is to a point that I think you made, and I want everybody to take part in this. About our comparison with other countries, and you made the point about Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. How do we compare now? Are there good parts as well where India does well in terms of the quality of disclosures, the extent of disclosures? Are we more transparent and open in some respects? And if there were 1 or 2 things that you would specifically suggest that have to be taken on board right now by the regulators, what would they be? 1 or 2 suggestions. That's the first part. And the second part, open to everybody, is Harsh, you made this point that regulators in India. How do I put this politely? I can't put this politely. They sometimes seem to squabble all the while, right? So there's a lot of turf issues and, amongst the various regulators. Again, is this a phenomenon you see in other countries as well? Do you see an SEC and a Fed and I don't know what else actually not coordinate when it comes to things like enabling market participants to discipline the markets, etc.? Is there a learning for regulators here? What's a model that we could follow to ensure that there is better, or at least we sense that there is better coordination, even if there isn't. At the moment, it doesn't even look like there's coordination on some respects, at least. Nandi, I'm going to start with you, and then anybody who wants to jump in.
If there is one positive aspect about Indian disclosures, which other markets may emulate, believe it or not, it is the quality of government information on individual industry. So whether it is the DGCA, the Director General of Civil Aviation, or the Department of Telecoms, or RBI's reports of trend and progress of banking in India, it is that information that they give that you can cross-check what each individual issuer says about market share, about customers, about ARPU, with that government information going back to 2 decades. And then it is almost paradoxical. On one hand, the regulator seems to be reluctant to crack the whip and say, bring the disclosures to an acceptable level. And on the other hand, the regulator provides such good information for investors and analysts to cross-check and evaluate the counterparty strength. So it just shows at the cost of, it just shows that if we want to, we can, improve the quality of our disclosures, to state-of-the-art levels. So somewhere the will seems to be lacking.
Got it. and any model, anybody on inter-regulatory coordination and cooperation.
Anant, very few large economies have such fragmented regulation. In most cases, there is some integrating. UK has a conduct authority. So I think either you have a super structure above the regulators. We had tried with FSDC, it hasn't worked. Or you integrate regulation, at least the supervisory part. Keep regulation separate, but supervision part, which is where disclosures come. You can create which is what, by the way, FSLRC had suggested.
Yeah.
Obviously, no regulator liked it for obvious reasons.
I'm glad again Mr. Vishwanathan is not here. Otherwise, you would have again. But great. Look, we're out of time completely. Professor Chipalkatti, special thanks to you. You woke up early in the morning. I don't know how your trek tomorrow is going to be. You're probably going to have nightmares about Naren's prognostications about the markets, etc. Bothering your trek. But truly appreciate all of you. I think this was a very rich discussion. We're out of time completely, but I would have loved to continue it. I'm not going to try to summarize this. But as far as the Dvara team is concerned, I think lots of rich inputs from knowledgeable academics who have seen this, who have done a lot of work on this, and practitioners and people like Harsh who combine both. I think it's a fantastic mix, a lot of inputs, a lot of takeaways. Deepti, over to you, but this has been really enriching. I've learned a lot, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. This has just been absolutely brilliant as a panel, and I suppose I just really, I'm not going to summarize what just transpired, but I think for me almost every sentence had a research question attached to it, right? Like we could and then I think the challenge for us to say which questions are we now going to pick and then put our weight behind. It's been just absolutely brilliant again. We will make sure that if any of you have issues with the recording, please let us know, but otherwise we'll make sure that transcripts, etc., are made available for public consumption. While our reports have been discussed and presented at various fora, we will continue the roadshow on this, particularly also taking it to the accounting authority, the ICAI, and other bodies where we feel some of these messages will be very, very important. But this is just the beginning. I think there are a whole bunch of things that we need to kind of wake up to and also work towards. So I just want to leave that there. Again, tremendous gratitude to each of you for having participated and spend the 1.5 hours, because then we get into a lot of detail and a lot of depth around this. And I see the passion that each of you bring, and the experience really just shows it's been just brilliant for us as a team to watch, and for the wider community who's now going to have access to this discussion.